let us start with the second part of The Selfish Giant. In the last part, we concluded that the children were very sad and depressed because they had to play on the road that was full of dust and stones. See how the weather remarks at the giant's selfishness. Then the spring came, and all over the country there were little blossoms and little birds. Only in the garden of the selfish giant it was still winter. The birds did not care to sing in it as there were no children, and the trees forgot to blossom. Once a beautiful flower put its head out from the grass, but when it saw the notice board, it was so sorry for the children that it slipped back into the ground again and went off to sleep. The only people who were pleased were the snow and the frost. Spring has forgotten this garden, they cried. So we will live here all the year round. The snow covered up the grass with her great white cloak, and the frost painted all the trees silver. With time, spring season came all over the country. But to the giant's garden, there was prevailing winter. As the time passed by, spring season came and flowers blossomed everywhere, and little birds were chirping all around. There was weather of fun and frolic all over. But to the giant's garden, there was nothing. But the spring did not arrive in the giant's garden. There were barren winters only. Who were there to enjoy the winter? The snow and the frost. They were enjoying their time in the beautiful garden of the selfish giant. Trees and flowers were not blossoming. No birds were chirping. However, the snow and the frost were happy. The snow covered up the grass with a white cloak, and frost covered trees. This is actually how the weather wanted to punish the giant for his selfishness towards the innocent children. The snow and the frost were not contented within themselves. Then they invited the north wind to stay with them, and he came. He was wrapped in furs, and he rode all day about the garden and blew the chimney pots down. "This is a delightful spot," he said. "We must ask the hail on a visit." So the hail came. Every day for 3 hours he rattled on the roof of the castle till he broke most of the slates, and then he ran round and round the garden as fast as he could go. He was dressed in grey, and his breath was like ice. The north wind accepted the invitation of the snow and the frost. He came immediately into the giant's garden. He wrapped himself in furs. That is, it was bitterly cold, and he rode all day about the garden. That is, the force it applied to the giant's garden. The intensity is here described by the roaring of the north wind. And the intensity was so high that it blew the chimney pots down. The north wind wanted to enjoy the winter in the giant's garden along with the hail. The hail immediately responded to the north wind. It came on a visit to the giant's garden. What it did every day for 3 hours, the hail rattled on the roof of the castle, and it broke most of the slates on the roof. And he enjoyed the winter running round and round the garden as fast as he could. The hail was dressed in grey, and his breath was like ice. The north wind was invited to stay by the snow and frost. They brought chaos in the garden. Then they planned to invite hail. He fell on the roof of the castle and broke most of its slates. He was dressed in grey, and the condition of the giant's garden was beyond description. I cannot understand why the spring is so late in coming, said the selfish giant, as he sat at the window and looked out at his cold white garden. I hope there will be a change in the weather. The giant also could not understand why the spring was so late in coming. But the giant was waiting eagerly and was hopeful that there will be a change in the weather very soon. But the spring never came, nor the summer. The autumn gave golden fruit to every garden, but to the giant's garden she gave none. He is too selfish, she said. So it was always winter there, and the north wind, and the hail, and the frost, and the snow danced about through the trees. Although the giant was hopeful that the spring would come very soon, but he became hopeless when neither spring nor summer arrived in his garden. The autumn gave golden fruit to every garden. But how disheartening! To the giant's garden, the autumn gave none. Why? Do you know? Because the autumn realized that the giant was so selfish to the innocent children that The giant's garden did not need any transmission. Actually, the weather wanted to punish the giant, wanted him so that he could realize why the winter stayed so long, or the seasons of spring, summer, or autumn did not come to his garden. So, who were there in the giant's garden? They were all the agents of winter, like the north wind, the hail, the frost, and the snow. They were enjoying their time in the giant's garden. One morning, the giant was lying awake in bed when he heard some lovely music. It sounded so sweet to his ears that he thought it must be the king's musicians passing by. It was really only a little linnet singing outside his window, but it was so long since he had heard a bird sing in his garden that it seemed to him to be the most beautiful music in the world. One morning, when the giant was lying awake in bed, the giant heard the melodious song of a bird. The music sounded so sweet to the giant's ear that initially he thought that it must be the king's musician passing by. The king's musicians are always the most skillful musicians of the kingdom. So, the giant compared the linnet's song to the king's musicians. When he came out and looked out of his casement, he found that it wasn't the king's musicians, but only a little linnet singing outside his window. It was actually the longing that, or the desire of listening or hearing a bird's song in his garden. It was so long since he had heard, so that it seemed to him that the linnet's song must be the most beautiful music in the world. Suddenly, everything changed in the giant's garden. After a long time, then the hail stopped dancing over his head, and the north wind ceased roaring, and a delicious perfume came to him through the open casement. Now the giant had got the confidence, and he said that I believe the spring has come at last. In order to see spring in his garden, the giant jumped out of bed and looked out. How much yearning was the giant's heart? It was quite clear. The way the giant jumped out of bed and looked out to watch the spring in his garden, which had appeared after a long time, and finally the agents of the winter stopped their activities in the giant's garden. Let me analyze to you the second part of the story. The harsh, long-winded winter weather is the consequence of the giant's selfishness. By rejecting the children, the giant has unknowingly rejected the other good and natural things which once resided in his garden. Just as the giant's selfishness drives out warmth and cheer, it attracts only cold, inhospitable weather. The implicit comparison between the cold-hearted giant and the wintry weather around him is straightforward enough. In broader terms, however, this section also suggests a system of cosmic justice at work, punishing the giant in a way that fits his scene. This moment establishes a clear cause and effect relationship between the giant's selfishness and his present suffering. The warm seasons do not return precisely because he is too selfish. The giant's inability to see this line of casualty shows that he is not yet ready to atone for what he did, and it also suggests that redemption is not easily achievable without some kind of moral guidance. No one has shown the giant the error of his ways, and so he cannot see the error at all. This moment also harkens back to his earlier claim that my own garden is my own garden, and anyone can understand that. With this, the giant frames his own standards of property and propriety as universal and expects others to see them as a plain matter of fact. But when faced with the actual laws of the universe, by his own admission, he cannot understand why spring does not come to his garden. The giant has been so long deprived of good weather that he now truly appreciates its value. This follows from the Christian idea that suffering has purifying, redemptive power. Suffering, a long penance, makes goodness feel all the sweeter, and it makes one all the more eager to participate in it. Since the long winter was the direct result of the giant's selfishness and was uniquely suited to his sin, it can be considered a penance in this context. Clearly, it has had the intended psychological effect of a penance. A linnet also appears in Wilde's The Devoted Friend, another fairy tale story that deals with selfishness, generosity, and friendship. So this is the end of part 2. We will again continue with part 3 very shortly.